Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we looked at Key Cavern and got ourselves the Pegasus boots. This time, we're taking a little detour from the main story dungeons to look at the Color Dungeon, an optional side dungeon that was not even in the original release of the game. But before we get into the actual dungeon, there's a few things to discuss. So let's hop right into it. Link's Awakening was originally released on the Game Boy in 1993, but that Game Boy release also happens to be the one version of the game that I'm not playing for this video series. 5 years later, Link's Awakening was to be re-released on the Game Boy Color, and aside from the added, color, they further sought to incentivize players to repurchase the game by including a brand new, albeit optional, dungeon. The aptly named Color Dungeon. I was a bit conflicted initially about when during this series to cover this dungeon. Part of me felt that it should be done last, since it is an optional dungeon that is not even available in all versions of the game. So in many ways, it is an outlier. Therefore, it could make some sense to draw a clear division there between this and the main story dungeons. But on the other hand, I'm sure these days the majority of people who have played Link's Awakening have played one of the many re-releases that includes this dungeon, and while it can be done at pretty well any point onwards, right after Key Cavern is the earliest it can be accessed through normal means. So it would also make sense to cover it here and now, between Key Cavern and Angler's Tunnel, when most players would likely play through it. I was indecisive, so in the end I ran a poll, with the results heavily in favor of that latter option. So thank you to everyone who voted and left a comment. Actually gaining access to the dungeon is simple. In something of a callback to the Book of Medora in A Link to the Past, we can use the Pegasus boots to knock this book off the shelf in the Mabe library and read this hint. The numbers and arrows simply correspond to the sequence and directions that we need to push these headstones in the graveyard. And that's about it. As near as I can tell, the order is consistent across playthroughs as well, unlike the Windfish's Egg, so technically you could get in here sooner if you simply memorize the directions or brute force through it, as some people have pointed out to me that they did. But on an average playthrough, accounting for when the game feeds you this info, this is the soonest you could reasonably get here. But once you know, it's quite simple. So that's about it. Once we've completed this puzzle, watch out for the Guineas, we can head down into the dungeon. This is the Color Dungeon. And it's alright. In terms of its overall structure, it has some neat things going on and isn't tied down to being shaped after a particular object like the previous dungeons have been. However, it isn't a dungeon I would rank very highly compared to the rest of this game's offerings. But first, the dungeon music. The theme here is a remix of the main dungeon theme from the original NES Legend of Zelda. Honestly, I like it. Maybe it's my nostalgia for Zelda 1, but I think it's a good fit for this dungeon, which compared to the others in this game, feels the most like a Zelda 1 dungeon in terms of the layout and navigation. The Switch remake once again faithfully updates the track, giving it just a bit of extra depth. I particularly like this section of the track, which I don't think was in the NES original. It takes a break from the deep brass and strings to give way for a less dramatic and more melancholic feeling. This also works to keep the track in line with the rest of this game's dungeon themes, having that alternation between tension and curiosity, which is exactly the right mood for a dungeon theme. As for the color theme, the dungeon mostly uses this fairly well, but it all comes across as pretty superficial to me. We have color-based puzzles, enemies who blend into the color of the floor tiles in some areas, color coding to indicate hazards, and a color-based reward at the end of the dungeon. But that's about it. I see what they were going for, but a theme like color is pretty vague, and the idea falls apart when you realize the way that the remake downplays the significance of said color theming. Most of the color-based puzzles and hazards have other visual tells added in addition to the coloration. There's cracks added to the collapsing floor tiles to indicate how close they are to breaking, and shapes to match for these color puzzles, both with the orb monsters that we toss into these holes, and with these rotating switch puzzles, where we have to make them all match. Don't get me wrong, I like that they added these extra visual indicators. Colorblind people exist, and there's a good chance that this dungeon was a true struggle without those changes. So this was likely an accessibility thing, and that's welcome in my books. But it also further highlights the superficiality of that theming. Though one decent use of color is with these blobby enemies called camo goblins, where they blend in with certain sections of the floor, which again, neat concept, but something that doesn't get put to use in a very interesting way. Ironically, this is a concept that would later be better realized in the Oracle games. But I digress. Visually speaking, I find it overall kind of bland looking. The DX version has this grainy wall texture and gray flagstone floor, and it just isn't that interesting to look at most of the time. For a place called Color Dungeon, it just isn't all that colorful, though I do like these vibrant, magic-looking floor tiles here and there. Those look great. The remake is a little better to look at overall, and I really mean only a little, though those aforementioned floor tiles get changed up here, and I have mixed feelings about that. The patterns are changed to differ color to color, which I like, but they are static now instead of having that neat little magic effect. It's not the biggest deal, but I guess the rest of the architecture is so bland that these little bits of flair stood out to me. They still look nice though, and I'll take any bit of color that I can get in this place. As for navigation, the dungeon has what I'm calling a two-pronged design. You'll reach a point with a fork in the road and two main paths that you can take, which both take you into mid-boss fights. One path ultimately leads towards the dungeon boss, while the other one has the boss key. I like that the dungeon lets you do quite a bit of exploration and potentially could let you get all the way up to the boss door without the boss key. Though these two paths are the main critical paths, there's still a good few splits in the road here and there with side rooms, which you'll need to explore to get small keys and even the map. That stuff is all good in my books. I like the feeling of poking around and just being able to explore until I hit dead ends, though I do think that some of these locked doors should not be quite so deep into each route, so that you know just a little bit sooner when you need to turn around, backtrack, and find some more keys, especially since the dungeon doesn't have any sort of central room or hub area, so that time spent backtracking can add up quite a bit. I think this little loop in the path near the start of the dungeon is great, a nice streamlined bit of design in the layout, where we see a locked door, explore and find a key, then get dropped back here through this one-way door. But we're also shown a different fork in the road in that east section, so there's some great decision making on which path to take. That's all good stuff. It just would have been nice for them to add in at least one more loop in the path like that, maybe after getting the boss key, for example. So there's some good elements at play here. The issue is that the dungeon just doesn't do much with any of it. Every puzzle is limited to being an individual room puzzle, either as a means to obtain a key or simply open the door in front of you. And the hazards and puzzles are recycled in a way that just isn't all that interesting. The best of the bunch are these color matching puzzles with these rotating switches, and while they do start simple and then get iterated upon, you can really only take this mechanic so far. There's also a single one of these gem switches, which are usually used nicely for multi-room puzzles, but it's used only in this one room to do this. And those are colorful puzzle elements. They could have built that into the dungeon in a really interesting way, but they just don't do anything with it. They don't even introduce it until the last room before the boss fight. And I think that's the main issue here. They don't really commit to any mechanics or design ideas. The dungeon is like a sampler pack of puzzle ideas and concepts that lacks any cohesion. And aside from finding the handfuls of small keys, nothing you do in any one room matters outside of that room. There are no puzzles that have any impact on the rest of the dungeon. The lack of a dungeon item here doesn't help matters either. There's no unique new ability or mechanic that puzzles could be based around with that either. And I get that they have the reward at the end of the dungeon, which could be seen as the dungeon item, but that's only going to help us after the dungeon, not during the dungeon. Probably the coolest thing about the dungeon is the combat focus. Like how these enemies will slowly destroy the floor tiles, both increasing the amount of hazards as well as adding a sense of urgency to fighting them, and the inclusion of not one, but two mid-bosses. Those are Avalanche, aka the Stone Hinox, and the Giant Buzz Blob. Avalanche is pretty straightforward to fight, but there are a lot of hazards in the room, such as falling rocks and spikes on the floor. So this battle is more about being mindful of your positioning, avoiding taking damage, and striking when possible. As for the Giant Buzz Blob, he has two forms. In the first one, he is invulnerable to your attacks, so you have to use magic powder to change him to his second form, which is when you'll be able to attack. His attacks are a lot less aggressive compared to Avalanche, so this fight feels a little more strategic instead of skill-based. So in a sense, these two mid-bosses cover a bit of both styles, and that's cool. But aside from that, there isn't a whole lot else going for this place. The navigation is just not that complicated or interesting, which after Key Cavern feels like a noticeable dip in the difficulty curve, alas. Once we've beaten both mid-bosses and made our way through these puzzles and traps, we can confront the dungeon boss. This is the hard-hit beetle. And that was the hard-hit beetle. So yeah, last time I said that Slime Eye might be the easiest boss in the game, with an asterisk that I would have to reevaluate that after Angler's Tunnel. But I guess I forgot about Hard Hit Beetle because, jeez, what a pushover. I guess the angle here is that he's trying to play mind games with you. He tells you to back off and take your time, but really, you can just keep attacking him, and he dies really quickly. He also changes color as he takes damage, and this could have been an opportunity to incorporate some sort of color-based puzzle element into the fight. But that just doesn't happen. Nothing really happens. Heck, the color aspect is so meaningless that they straight up remove mention of it in the remake. It's too bad too, because he's designed to be a giant version of a hard hat beetle, who are notoriously annoying enemies in 2D Zelda. So why is he such a pushover? Why are both mid-bosses harder than the dungeon boss itself? How would I fix it? Here's an idea. Remember those magic-looking colored floor tiles? Let's put those around the room. Have him keep changing color, but make it so that he's only vulnerable when standing on the corresponding colored floor tile, and incorporate the rubbery knockback mechanic that common hard hat beetles have. And you could put some pitfalls around the room too if you want to make things a little harder. Then, the fight becomes about strategically positioning yourself and the boss in order to deal damage. The color theme would actually matter, and the fight might have some real challenge to it. If we're worried about keeping it in line with the rest of the color-based puzzles for the sake of accessibility, then you can add some shapes or patterns on them that we can use as well. But of course, that's just not what we get here. Instead, just wail on him with your sword, and he will go down very quickly. Once he's defeated, we'll get our... Wait, no heart container? Okay, I realize that in the DX version, they were kind of already locked into the original version's heart capacity, so they couldn't add in a new heart container, but they greatly increased the max heart count in the Switch remake. They really couldn't have thrown a heart container in here? Really? But what we will get is a choice between the red and blue mail. Red improves your attack power, while blue offers damage reduction. Essentially, offense versus defense. The choice is yours, and I think that's a really cool reward. I go for blue personally. I like the look, and since we'll get a different attack increase later, I like to balance it out. Plus, most common enemies are not strong enough for you to see the benefit of both attack buffs stacked anyways. But that's just me, but I like that it lets you choose. Overall, the color dungeon is okay. In many ways, it feels like a Zelda 1 dungeon, with its lack of a general theme or even larger rooms, which feels like something of a regression from how the level design has gradually evolved over the course of the NES titles, A Link to the Past, and then this game. And frankly, some of these rooms feel like pointless filler. But the main issue is that the dungeon doesn't feel like it commits to anything. This can be seen as early as the first room, where these two skeletons, humorously named Gar and Dion, will tell you to stock up on magic powder and even offer to sell you some, but you can find some for free in the next room. And magic powder is only used during one of the two mid-bosses, not for any puzzles. The navigation just isn't that complicated, but there are long stretches of paths to take on either of the two prongs, which trips me up a little. I always want to explore as thoroughly as possible in a dungeon, so I tend to end up feeling like I've gone too far down either critical path and missed something, and then I end up backtracking way more than necessary. That's on me, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who plays this dungeon, finds a split in a path, gets 4 rooms deep into one of them, and then worries that they've gone too far in a single direction, and then turns around. Moving a few of those locked doors to be just a room or two sooner could potentially alleviate that, or just add more keys and locked doors entirely instead of moving the ones that are already there. That could work too. I also personally think the map and compass locations should have been swapped, just to make the navigation that much more intuitive. It feels like we find the compass way too soon and the map way too late. Probably my favorite aspect of the dungeon though is the rotating color switch puzzles. I love this type of thing. It really demands that you gain an understanding of how it works, and is for sure the sort of puzzle that will be way harder to brute force through than to just take a moment to think about. That's great. But overall, the color theming and heck, pretty much the rest of the dungeon just ends up feeling shallow and underdeveloped. To sum it up, it has some good rooms, some fun moments with good puzzles, but overall, as one larger picture, the dungeon strangely feels lesser than the sum of its parts. Thank you so much for watching this video, and special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and I truly hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.